Hi everybody. I promised this video a long time ago, and so I'm glad that I finally am getting the time to sit down, hash it out, and present it to you guys. I'm talking, of course, as the title above indicates, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition that Fantasy Flight Games released not too long ago. It's a very controversial RPG right now, and it gets a lot of flack and a lot of people saying, "Oh God, it's a board game. It has too many bits. It can't possibly be role played. What is this nonsense?" And I think a lot of it's unfair. Having really read it, having played it, having looked at it with a game designer's eye, like a critical eye, for why they made some of the game design decisions that they did. I think I've really gotten to know the game very well, and I've come to really appreciate it. Now, it's not a perfect game, not that I've ever encountered anything resembling a perfect RPG, but there are definitely some really good ideas to it, and I wanted to share some of those ideas with people. And this is probably going to be more of an overview than an actual review. I will just be showcasing some of the different mechanics and elements that make up the characters, how the game generally works, and what all the fiddly bits do. Like, okay, so you've seen these previews, you've seen these pictures of the 1001 bits that come in the box, but what do those bits do? What do they mean, and how are they used in the game? And so I hope to kind of enlighten people and show them really how it works, show them really what all these bits and pieces are, and so to give people, an appropriate perception of what the game really is. And it really is a role-playing game, in my opinion. It's no board game, RPG amalgam, or any of this nonsense. It's a role-playing game. It's just it presents its information in some interesting and unique ways. So when we're talking about Warhammer Roleplay 3rd Edition, it's probably best to talk about the core mechanics, because that's one of the most significant changes from previous editions. As I mentioned in my 2nd edition review, the 1st and the 2nd edition of Warhammer used a percentile system. So just about everything in the game was rolled using percentile dice against, the value of whatever trait. So in 3rd edition, you have most of the same character components in terms of the same attributes, most of the same skills, etc., etc., but 3rd edition uses a dice pool system rather than a percentile mechanic. And the way that it works is you have the same basic attributes, but they're now rated on a scale of 1 to 5. Truly, some attributes can reach 6. It's rare and difficult to do this, but the practical limit for most attributes is a level of 5, with 3 representing about the average human capability in an attribute. And so already this starts to draw some comparisons to Old World of Darkness, and even to a slightly lesser extent New World of Darkness. And indeed, if you're familiar with Old or New World of Darkness, I think you'll find that the dice mechanics themselves are very quick and easy to pick up. It's actually one of the first things that came to my mind that I noticed about Warhammer's new dice pool system, is that it felt like the Old World of Darkness in a number of ways, and I will showcase those in a moment. So what happens is, whenever you're testing an attribute, you roll a number of dice equal to the value of that attribute that you're rolling. So if you had 3 dice in strength, and you were trying to break open a door, and then you take 3 attribute dice and you roll them, and you are looking for successes. Now, as everybody has probably known or heard of, Warhammer 3rd Edition uses custom funky dice. Yes, it uses dice with symbols on them. And I'll just kind of show you this real quick here. This is an attribute die, and as you can see, this is just a blue D8. That's all it is, but there are no numbers on this die. It's all symbology. And honestly, whoa, that is kind of cool. So the first thing you pick up right away is that there are these little hammer symbols on the die. And that is actually Sigmar's hammer, Ghal Maraz, for those of you who know Warhammer and know the background. You're not required to know that to know how the game works. That's just a little bit of extra fluff. But so anyway, the hammer symbol represents a success. So for each of the attribute dice that you roll that come up showing a hammer, you get 1 success. And most of the time you might just need 1 success to perform an action, but the difficulty can be based, it can be set by the game master, and it could be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 successes, or whatever it is that he wants you to, or decides that you need in order to accomplish your goal. And there's another way that difficulty is gauged in terms of the mechanics, and I'll go into that in a moment. But so there are actually 4 sides on this die, with the hammer symbols on them. So there's a 50% chance of any attribute die garnering a success. Now there's also 25% chance, as referenced by these two sides that bear a griffin. And the griffin represents a boon. A boon, while not as significant as a success, is generally a minor positive consequence as the result of the action that you're taking. And so it is possible to fail at an action, i.e. not roll any successes, but to have something minorly beneficial occur as a result of what you're attempting to do through the boons. Now there are also two blank sides on the die, and so there's a 25% chance of rolling nothing, of no benefit from the die, but there's otherwise no negative consequences of rolling an attribute die. It either gives you successes, boons, or it doesn't give you anything. So, obviously if you roll nothing, then you don't get enough successes to achieve the task, you fail, but otherwise there's nothing bad about attribute dice. They don't harm you in any way. So, I mentioned that there's another way that the game measures difficulty, and that's through something called a challenge die. And a challenge die is also a D8, but it's a purple D8. And these are given out, these are assigned to tasks by the game master based on the difficulty of whatever action you're attempting, and usually in numbers of 1 for pretty minorly simple tasks to up to 4 for incredibly difficult tasks. The really heroic, over-the-top type of stuff. But you'll notice that the primary result that occurs on this challenge die is these crossed swords. And the crossed swords are called a challenge, and a challenge basically negates a success. So when you're building a dice pool, you'll have a number of challenge dice, and you'll have a number of attribute dice, and there are a few other dice I'll talk about in a moment that get added in there too. But basically, you roll these all together, and then you do kind of a series of cancellations. So every challenge cancels a success. And then there's also skulls that appear on these challenge dice, as well as on a few of the other dice. And these skulls are called banes, and banes do the same thing, or are the antithesis to boons. So where boons represent positive consequences, banes represent negative consequences that might come about during your action. And just like the challenges cancel successes, the banes cancel boons. And so, basically you roll all these dice together, you do kind of a series of cancellations, and you find out what you're left with. If you still have successes left over, you succeed at the task. If you still have boons left over, you might have something good happen, etc., etc. Likewise, the other direction. If you have banes left over, then something bad happens. Now there's also one especially significant result on the challenge die, and there's a 1 in 8 chance of rolling a Chaos Star. And if you remember my setting review, Chaos is the big bad evil power that permeates the Warhammer world, and it's not a good thing. And so rolling Chaos Stars usually means that something very bad is about to happen. That's never character ending or anything like that. It's character's not getting maimed or crippled, but spellcasters are especially vulnerable to these Chaos Stars, because when they're casting their magic, whenever Chaos Stars come up on the challenge dice, it means that a Chaos misfire or backlash can occur. And these are generally not things that you want. But anybody, not just spellcasters, anybody who rolls Chaos Stars is going to be in for a little bit of hurt. So there's not something that you want. I was just going to mention as well that not only are there single challenges on this die, but there are a couple of sides with a double challenge, and yes, that cancels 2 successes that you've rolled in your dice pool. Now, so you build a dice pool by combining attribute dice, and then through the GM throwing in some challenge dice, and you roll them together. Well, there's another way that your character can influence the outcome of their actions, and that's by taking something called a stance. And all characters can take stances, and your character's career will influence his starting kind of stance levels, but you can also adjust that, during character advancement. You have some options in terms of affecting your character's stance. Well, what does stance mean? Stance is basically your character's approach on a case-by-case basis for a particular action that they're attempting. And you can be in a neutral stance, which basically means that you're not leaning one way or the other. You're just kind of in the moment, going with the flow, just doing what you need to do. But your character can also opt to take what's called a conservative stance. And conservative stance means you're being cautious, you're looking for accuracy, you're taking your time, you're lining up your shot, and basically you just want to take the extra time and effort to make sure you get it right. So it's a very low risk, low reward type of scenario that you're wanting to minimize the risks, and you're not going to get any spectacular successes, but you want to make sure that you make that action count. Likewise, on the opposite end of the scale, you can assume a reckless stance, and reckless is 3 sheets to the wind, wailing, sword swinging above your head, charging into battle with bloodlust in your eyes, and basically you might overextend yourself because you're trying too hard, or overexerting yourself, or leaving yourself open to a counterattack, or basically being reckless. And so it's a high risk, high reward type of stance when you want that spectacular success, when you want to knock it out of the park. It's an all or nothing type of thing, and you're willing to risk having some potentially negative consequences as a result of it. And so stances are represented as well by dice. There are special dice, and I'm going to go into more detail on those now. So what happens is when your character assumes a stance, and you can choose, there are mechanics for how you kind of throttle your character's stance, but you can basically choose what type of approach you want to take on any given action. And so when you do this, depending upon how far into a stance, how reckless or how conservative you want your character to be, you actually substitute attribute dice for some of those stance dice. And so if you had 3 dice, some of these dice, might get replaced with stance dice, depending upon, again, how deep you go into that stance. And it could be some or it could be all of them, and it just depends. So the green die here is a conservative die. And a conservative die is a green D10, and it also has the little hammer symbols on there. So just like the attribute dice, these symbols mean successes. So on a conservative die, there's actually a 70% chance of rolling a success as opposed to 50. Now, one of the downsides of the conservative die is that you have a couple of sides that have this little, it's got the hammer symbol, which again means you rolled a success, but there's also this little hourglass there, and the hourglass means a delay. And what that means is that your character was being conservative, he was taking his time. Unfortunately, he took a little bit too much. He was a little too cautious, he was waiting just a little bit too long, and so your character might still succeed, but it means that in combat it might push you down the initiative ladder a little bit, so you go later in the round during future rounds. It might mean that it affects certain actions. So it's, your character was aiming with his bow and he wasn't paying attention, so he didn't see the enemy rushing up beside him. So it takes him a few extra seconds to kind of pick up his shield and to block the blow. And so he could potentially be left vulnerable. And so there are a number of ways that it can come into effect, but it means that your character has hesitated or has delayed to the point that it might affect some future actions. Now the reckless die has some interesting qualities about it as well. It's this red D10, and it, like the normal attribute die, has a 50% overall chance of rolling at least 1 success, but there are a couple of sides to the die that actually can generate 2 successes. So a single die can actually generate more than 1 success for you. But on the downside, there are a few sides of the reckless die that actually have banes on them, and there are a few sides that have the hammer symbol again, but that also have this little blood drop up there, and the blood drop represents fatigue or stress. Depending upon what type of action you are taking, you might have overexerted yourself, left yourself open, tripped and fell, or basically stressed yourself out, and so you might take stress or fatigue, which can potentially slow and impact your character's performance. Fatigue, enough fatigue can potentially knock your character unconscious. Enough stress can potentially inflict temporary or even permanent insanities on your character. So it's generally not a good thing. So again, you can get some spectacular successes with these reckless dice, but you also leave yourself open to being hindered by them. And so that's the basic kind of core that goes on with a lot of with a lot of the dice that you roll. They're the attributes. You convert some depending upon what your character's current stance is, and then the game master throws in challenge dice. But there's also another kind of die that represents skill, and it's called the expertise die, and it's this yellow d6. And it has a number of different effects on it. It's got a standard success symbol. I think right there I showed you there's another boon, there's a griffin right there. But there are a couple of special, significant, unique sides that this expertise die has. And so there's one right here, and this is, again, Ghal Maraz with a little plus sign down there in the bottom corner, if you can see that. And what that is, that's a righteous success. And basically that's an exploding die. Anytime you roll a righteous success, you get to pick up another expertise die and roll it and take the benefits of that as well. And as long as you continue rolling righteous successes, you continue rolling extra dice. And there's also another significant side on the expertise die, and that is Sigmar's Comet. And Sigmar's Comet is kind of the antithesis of the Chaos Star. It can mean some significant critical results. Basically, it's like rolling a crit. And depending upon what type of action you're taking, depending upon the scenario, and depending upon what you're trying to accomplish with your character's action, it can have, and the player oftentimes has a number of choices to make about how he wants the Chaos Star, how he wants Sigmar's Comet to influence his roll. And again, just like the attribute dice, there are no inherent bad sides to an expertise die. There is a single blank side, I believe, which won't give you any benefit, but all the other benefits, or all the other sides on the expertise die are positive. So the expertise die will never hinder you, it can only help you. And then there are two more final types of dice that can influence your rolls, and they are the fortune and misfortune dice accordingly. And the fortune dice are these little white dice right here, and the misfortune dice are these little black dice. And they kind of are like more minor versions of the attribute dice and the challenge dice. Fortune dice are basically usually given out as circumstantial modifiers, where in most role-playing games, say like the D20 system, a GM, if he feels you have favorable circumstances on your side, he might give you a +2 modifier, or some other modifier to your roll. Likewise, negative modifiers might subtract from your roll. In Warhammer 3rd Edition, this is handled through these dice. So whenever the GM decides that there's something beneficial happening, something that could, it's going to bolster your action, it's going to make it more likely for you to succeed, he'll probably throw a couple of fortune dice at you. Likewise, if there are some elements that will subtract from your success, he will assign some extra misfortune dice. And these are the least potent dice in the game, generally speaking. But again, basically, you've got a couple of sides. I think it's two sides on the fortune die that can result in a success, and one side that can result in a boon. And then for the misfortune die, you've got two sides that have a challenge and one side that has a bane. All the other sides are blank. So there's a 50-50 shot of them not affecting the outcome at all. But sometimes you might have more than one fortune or misfortune die affecting your die pool. So I'm going to give a quick demonstration of the dice pool in action. So give me just a moment. I'm going to collect some dice together. I'll collect a sample character, and we'll roll one of these out just to see what actually happens at the table.